I'm Kim McCleary, President and CEO, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to today's program. Thank you all for your ongoing support and viewership that has sustained us over these long, many months, more than a year. It is now my very great pleasure to welcome you to today's program, Russia and China, Preparing America for Our Greatest Challenge. We are pleased to welcome distinguished analysts Jack Devine and Dr. Jonathan Ward today. They will examine Russian and Chinese plans and the challenges they pose for the United States. Jack Devine spent 3 decades in the CIA and headed the agency's operation division. He draws on that experience for his new book, Spymaster's Prism: The Fight Against Russian Aggression. Dr. Jonathan Ward earned his doctorate at Oxford University and has consulted for governments and multinational corporations. His new book is China's Vision of Victory, in which he details China's determination to supplant the United States as the preeminent power. Today's moderator, Clayton Dube, director of the USC U.S. China Institute, we also appreciate the Institute's support as a program co-sponsor. Director Dube, it's nice to welcome you back. I welcome and turn the program over to you. Thank you so much for your time today.
Kim, thank you so much for this generous introduction. It's a delight to be with Jack Devine and Jonathan Ward today, and they should go ahead and turn their microphones and cameras on so that we can have them with us. It's an extreme pleasure. Folks, these are books well worth your time. Jack Devine, this is his second book looking at the current challenge posed by Russia, and definitely worth your time. And we also have Jonathan Ward, who has this book, China's Vision of Victory. And it's not on the cover, but included on the title page is, and what America needs to do to win. That statement. They have devoted a lot of years, a lot of energy to developing the analytical capacity to produce these books. And so let's jump right in. And I wanted to begin, there's some similarities between the worldview of our authors, but I wanted to begin with Jack Devine and ask, essentially, you've put forward the notion that we do not understand where Russia is, and we don't understand where Russia wants to be. And so you've argued that we need to see Russia as a strategic adversary and to recognize that Russian intelligence is ambitious, it's able, and in some cases, it's proven effective. And so I was wondering if you could expand on some of the ideas in your book where you talk about Russia's aim is not just irritating the United States, but seeking to increase Russian influence, not just here, but everywhere. Jack?
Clay, thank you for that great introduction. It actually gets to the heart of the book. And Jonathan, I think, presents a really good not counterweight, because I think we're going to agree on most things. Although I want to repudiate that I put that very nice comment on the cover of your book, Jonathan. So I've known Jonathan a long time, and we're really good friends, and I hope we have fun today. There's no doubt China is the major geopolitical economic threat on the long term. What I think is missing is to appreciate how important Russia is in the immediacy of the threat that we are now facing. And that's inside the United States. And the thing that got me troubled, why the book tracks Russian intervention for many years, what really triggered the book was their intervention in 2016. And I appreciate, Kim, and your comments about my analytical skills, but I want to make sure everybody out there understands I was an operator. I'm a spy master's spy. So I'm going to defer to to Jonathan for profound comments. But when I looked at it, and as we got further away, it's much more interesting because we got fixated on people in the election. But if you stood back during the Cold War, and I think this is something not generally understood, we had an understanding between the Russians and ourselves. We're called Moscow rules. There's two sets of them. I don't want to deal with the one on what you wear in Moscow to be a spy. But the one I'm talking about is, what was our understanding? It's not written down. And why we fought everywhere around the world, and I ran the program to get the Russians out of Afghanistan in the late 80s. We had rules that said we were not going to interfere internally in Russia, and they were not going to interfere internally in the United States in our political system. There are exceptions. But the one thing that is so shocking, particularly in the context of cyber today, the Russians are meddling politically, trying to, I don't want to dramatize it, wreak havoc, but they're trying to create an environment that weakens our political process. And that is more threatening than what the Chinese are doing. The Chinese are in here collecting very vigorously, so are the Russians. But my concern and the primary focus is the fact that they broke the rules. They have not been reset. And how is the new administration, or how is the old administration, going to deal with this Russia very aggressive program, which is part of their grand strategy? Now, I don't want to go on other than to set the stage here on this. So it's not about where China is, and Jonathan and I aren't really going to debate that issue at all. I mean, well, we will probably around the edges, but I'm really talking about something that I don't think is understood. And I was talking to a fellow today on the radio about the Mueller investigation, and he was flabbergasted when he read it how much spying stuff is in there, and that's irrefutable. But my point is, we're not putting the right focus on it, and we need to understand. We need to find a way to stop it.
Well, and let me, I want to jump to Jonathan, but one quick follow-up for you, Jack, and that is, you, as you mentioned, in the 1980s, ran the efforts against the Soviet Union, then Soviet Union, in Afghanistan, and you walk out the door as a CIA employee in 1999, just as Vladimir Putin is coming on the scene as Prime Minister and President of Russia. And you've mentioned that this is striking because Putin comes out of the intelligence community. He knows what the Moscow rules were about, and yet he's breaking them. To what extent is this Vladimir Putin in action?
See, I think this is, again, Clay, I don't know who's giving your points, but they're great. Keep at it. But I have a chapter in a book. It's called Spymaster President, right? And right below it is a quote. And the quote says, "There is no such thing as an ex or former KGB officer, Vladimir Putin." Now, I would say the same thing for the comfort of the audience. There's no such thing as an ex CIA officer, Jack Devine. But what I'm really talking about, and I think what he's talking about, is that there's a way to look at the world. And it's through that intelligence prism. But when you look at him as a president, he looks like not just another political civilian. You got to step back and say, he was in the KGB. He tried to get in at 17 and was rejected because he was young, but he returned. He did very well, but he didn't serve in London and Paris and Mexico City and Japan and wined and dined with Westerners and developed a taste for it. He was assigned to Dresden. Right? For those of you that partied in Dresden during the Cold War, you know how grim that is. But he was there during the time of Marcus Wolf, the famous East German intelligence chief. In fact, he probably is the one who ran more agents than anybody in history at 100,000. It's Carla in John Curry's book. He was there when it collapsed, and I think it had a searing impact on his mind. I am never, if I have a role in life, it will be to restore Russia to its position of authority and power. And he went off, got very involved in the political arena. He ends up in the Yeltsin government. The big shots thought they control him. That's why they liked him. And they misread him because he was a good intelligence officer, manipulating and operating, and became president. My big problem with him is that he's still using the Dresden frame of mind of how the world is, that the United States is an implacable enemy. They're out to get us, and we need to do what we did it when the czars were here, or when the communists were here. We need to strengthen, weaken the borders, get the Crimea back, get Ukraine back, get our foot in the Middle East, and challenge the United States where we can. And I come back to the hybrid strategy and weaken the United States internally in its political process. I really believe Russia should be part of the West. We should have, ample exchanges and economic activity. But I served in Argentina many years ago, and I learned the tango. And if you don't can appreciate this, you need two to tango. And the problem here is we're going to want to dance with him, and he's sticking with the old game plan. And I think that's a tremendous hurdle. But when we're thinking we're going to charm this guy, or that somehow a nice relationship with him can be established, it has to be established on what I would call spymaster prisms type of rules, which are realism. Where does the rubber hit the road here, and what can we agree to? So I think looking at him in that context, might make for a more productive relationship with him.
Thank you so much, guys. Clay is just joining us. I think his computer crashed. So Jonathan, there he is. Clay is back. So Clay, I'll turn this back over to you.
You missed a terrific point. I'm sorry.
I have little doubt, and I apologize. I apologize to everyone. When I left, Jack was explaining once a spy, always a spy. Once a spy master, always a spy master. And I'm sorry for the computer glitches on my side. Hopefully we can get through the remainder of the session. And I hope, Jack, if it's okay, if I switch now to asking Jonathan to talk a little bit more. Jonathan's book came out a couple years ago. And at that time, channeled a lot of what folks in the US administration were saying, the revised national security strategy, and it builds on his experience living, traveling in China, but most importantly, reading carefully the things that Chinese leaders are saying today and the things that Chinese leaders have said. And so, Jonathan, one of the big points that you make in the book is it's all out there. We know what China hopes to accomplish. And so maybe you could say a little bit about that.
Absolutely. Thank you, Clay. And thanks, Jack. Great to be here. So, the main purpose of China's vision of victory is to explain to the reader the worldview of the Chinese Communist Party, China's government, in their own words, to allow the reader to enter into the mind and look at the world through the eyes of this organization, which in some ways is the most powerful single party in the world. And also to show that there's a continuity to this vision, a vision of ascendancy, of ultimately supremacy, of rising to the apex of world affairs as the dominant power in the international system. And in doing so, in their eyes, redressing the wrongs of history, because they believe essentially that they ruled the world. They were cast down in what they call the century of humiliation, humiliated at the hands of other, imperial powers at the time. This is the 1800s, and then that they'll rise again. As a friend of mine in Japanese defense said, it's a sort of a religious thing, sort of almost a Jesus story. They fall and they rise. So this is the party's worldview, and it is asserting itself in the geopolitical realities that we deal with. In the international system, in everything from high tech to the military balance to global diplomacy. I mean, we're finally contending with this force that used to be basically just an aspiration. And the other thing that matters is I think the United States and the wider world has begun to experience this and attribute this to Xi Jinping, the current dictator and general secretary of the Communist Party. But in fact, its roots are far deeper. And I say this as somebody whose doctorate at Oxford was based on access to Communist Party archives that have now been shut down and closed to the world, and getting an understanding of the original strategies and original foundational worldview of the founders of the People's Republic of China in 1949. I mean, they always sought in a way, their revolution, the Chinese Revolution, would bring China back to prominence and eventually preeminence among the major powers. So that's what we're dealing with, and it's also why, at the end of the day, I think many approaches to China, such as accommodation or shaping behavior, I would say are not going to succeed, because you're talking about a confidence in this regime that their moment has really come. They've accrued sufficient power economically and militarily, and that essentially they're unstoppable at this point. So when we see the changes in U.S.-China diplomacy, exemplified most recently at the Alaska meetings, where you have an explicit anti-Americanism, you have the themes that were rolled out by Mao Zedong 70 years ago. We will not be humiliated. You know, we will not tolerate interference in our internal affairs. This is not Xi Jinping. This is Mao Zedong. You know, this has been rolled out in the faces of U.S. diplomats in a way that says, you know, we're here to stay, and the moment that we've essentially aspired to, of this ultimate contest with America, has now arrived. So this is why it's something that we're going to be dealing with, and it's something that matters. And this is why I wrote the book. It matters to all Americans. I think as a country, we have to have this awakening to this geopolitical problem.
Now, thank you for that. And one of the things that Jack mentions in his book is that today's Russia is preoccupied with the United States, and specifically on the intelligence front, with the United States, with NATO, and then third, China. And in your book, you're mainly focused, Jonathan, you're mainly focused on the U.S.-China dimension, that rivalry. But maybe the two of you might discuss the extent to which China sees Russia as a potential partner, a potential rival, and for Jack, the same question, looking from the Russian perspective at China. And it's striking, of course, that the U.S.-China rapprochement, of course, began out of having a mutual adversary, the Soviet Union. You know, Nixon's approach in 1971, then his visit in 1972, was tied entirely on a strategy of ramping up pressure on the Soviet Union. And of course, Jack was already in the CIA working at this time. And so, you know, he was one of the folks on the ground seeing some of these things in action. But if the two of you could discuss the other country, the other member of this triumvirate.
Well, I think Jonathan raises a really good subject that people aren't thinking about, and that's communism. It's so stale, right, in most discourse, but it's central to Jonathan's presentation. I think central to understanding the spymaster Putin. I think you need to understand the history of the communist focus on China. But Clay, I wanted to just elaborate on the rankings. In the book, I talk about Comrade J. And Comrade J was the #2 person in New York and for the KGB. And he worked for the CIA for several years and then came out in 2004. He said, you know, one of the really interesting things when I went into the KGB as a young man, the #1 target was the United States, the #2 was NATO, and #3 was China. And he said, well, this was 2004 now. And he said, well, no, the #1 threat when I left was U.S., NATO, China. So what I'm trying to say is there's some implacable differences here. That when the juxtaposition of both countries and they're in terms of immediacy. Remember we had the old Sino-Soviet monolithic, and everybody thought that was glued forever. I learned a long time ago, don't put too much weight in. I think it's a marriage of convenience here. It's an arranged marriage, and I don't think it has legs. And I'll do one other story, and then I'd like to hear Jonathan. But so one of the things that I did when I was running the Afghan program was to get Soviet-style weapons. In other words, it had to be AK-47s and RPGs, and everything had a match. So there's not a lot of places in the world where you can get 125,000 AK-47s, right? Well, now that it's been published, there's not a secret here. Probably have a couple I can share, but this isn't one of them. You know, it's a matter of public record that I bought half Charlie Wilson had a disagreement over this, and someone want to know about Charlie Wilson in the world, we had to talk about it. But he was, well, let me stick to my point. So when I went out there, I bought the weapons from the Chinese. I also bought 9,000 mules a year. The city guy from Philadelphia, that's a really interesting story. But when I sat at the table and you went through the Anchorage back and forth, we love you friendship, although we didn't play by the rules this time. At the end of it, they walk out and it's all this maneuvering, and Jonathan lived through this, you lived through when you were out there. There's a format that you go through. And at the very end, he turned to me and said, look, you'll get the guns for 165. In other words, we were done with the charm offensive. And the question, it really came up, and it was for the Chinese, you know, and you know them much better, both of you, than I do. You expect an obtuse answer, and I think in my naivete, so they asked, well, you know, why are you selling them to us so cheap? And they said, yeah, we really like to see you do a number on the Russians. So I'm just saying there's a deep-seated mindset there about Russia fits into it. Let me hand it back to Jonathan. I think we're in a different position today, and I think Jonathan can draw some lines under that.
Well, and in fact, Jonathan told me, we spoke by the phone, that he originally intended to do his doctoral work on the Sino-Soviet split. He wound up focusing on the China-India border war and the overall China-India relationship. And so he's certainly aware of the fact that there's no love lost between these two. But Jonathan, maybe you could say a little bit about the uses China has for Russia.
Clay, that's a good word for it, because I think it's a use case relationship, and that's right. I mean, I speak Russian and Chinese, did those languages as an undergraduate, and wound up initially, you know, intending to work on nationalism in the Sino-Soviet split at Oxford, and I think there are two important. I mean, it does make sense to refer to history in this, and on one hand, there's the Sino-Soviet split, but there's actually something deeper, which is Russia-China first contact in the 1650s in the Amur River Valley, and this all sounds very obscure, but it kind of matters, because what happened was that when they first made contact as empires, you know, talking about 350 years ago, they pretty quickly hammered out a treaty called the Treaty of Nerchinsk in 1689 that allowed them to settle their borders. And then China expanded westward and essentially carried out a genocide of 1 million, steppe peoples. And Russia began to trade with Beijing. And this held for a little while, and it sort of created a stability in the relationship where both sides recognized that if they solved their own border, they could be free to do what they wanted in terms of their other interests. And I'm afraid that that's where we are in this relationship now. And we're in a situation where it's sort of similar to aspects of the Sino-Soviet alliance, where Stalin said to Mao, "Look, you're going to take charge of the Cold War in Asia, and I'm going to take charge of the Cold War in Europe. Any further questions? Let's go and do this." And right now, this is, as Jack said, a marriage of convenience, in the sense that they both are confronting the United States, and they're doing it, I think, in very different ways. And China is the only power in the world that can create a rival center of geopolitical gravity to the US, a rival economy that could potentially surpass ours. It has not yet. I think it's very important that we don't let it surpass ours. Potentially build up a military that can at least, potentially defeat us in Asia or the Indo-Pacific. But Russia can't do those things. I mean, Russia is essentially a disruptor, but Russia is a very useful state for China to have on side as they, go through this broader project of essentially rebuilding the world's balance of power in their favor. I mean, they have Russia essentially harassing the United States, keeping Europe distracted. And once again, the world sort of splits into those two pieces and creates a very big problem for America. So I think it is useful for us to focus on the nature of that relationship. I think it's also important for us to have our allies thinking about the Russia-China relationship as a whole. I mean, what you don't want, I used to brief British defense as an Oxford student on, as an American scholar of India and China, I talked to British MOD about, sort of the Asia Pacific security questions. And it was very clear that, I mean, for Britain and other European countries, I mean, the theater really is about Europe, and all the trade was happening with China. When you go to London and talk to bankers, and it was about investing in China. You go to defense and you talk about global security, and it was mostly about Europe. So I think that's a contradiction that Russia and China are able to exploit. But I think that's starting to change as Europe sort of wakes up more to the problems of Asia. And you know, at the end of the day, for Russia to be the junior partner in this relationship really replicates in reverse all the problems of the Sino-Soviet split. I mean, it came apart really because Mao didn't want to be a junior partner to the USSR, and he was explicitly using Russia as a shield against the United States, which he considered to be their chief adversary. So, you know, I think the point is this is built on very opportunistic foundations, but I think they're both quite invested in that opportunism, and something that hopefully won't last forever.
Let me address two of the things that pulled them together, right? So what is it about the United States that they don't like? Now, I said Putin looks at it as a spymaster's prism. Sitting here listening to Jonathan, the next book will be about the communist prism, right? So they look at the world differently, but it's very convenient for them to join forces on the human rights issues to push back against the United States, right? Because this is a central point of contention, so they joined forces on that. The other area where they started warming up was when the Russians went into Crimea, and the Chinese, you know, tipped their hat to them, and one of the very few, right? Now, was that done out of some magnanimous sense of unity? No, there's a little island off the coast of China that, you know, they're looking for reciprocity in the bigger scheme of things in Taiwan. So there are things that join them. There's one other point that I really enjoyed your introduction, Jonathan, about the communists, because, you know, you really have to get into it. But I think it's the weakness when we look at the great power of China. One of the things that was really fascinating during the Cold War when we were working against the Russians is how stale the product got. In other words, they were real believers in 1917 and during Stalin's time and fighting the Nazis and all that. But by the time I ran into them, there wasn't any real believer in communism. They were loyalists to their governments and to Russia, you know. But today, what I'm saying, they had a lousy product to sell, and it strengthened. I was in a much stronger position facing the KGB than vice versa. We had allies, and I think the same point needs to be taken into consideration. We're talking about their economic, political might, but we also have to talk about what's their illogical product that, you know, you make short-term relationships on money. You make longer terms when shared ideology. And I think it's a core weakness of how much leverage and influence vis-a-vis the United States, that there are boundaries around it. And I think we have to step back and realize what is China, as Jonathan does very well in his book. You know, what is China? Where is it going? And is that something that we're going to import to Canada and Mexico City? I kind of doubt it. Anyway, I think we've lost. Jonathan, over to you. We'll have to share the stage here.
Right.
So, you
well,
think of a question and I'll think of one. Or maybe Jessica will take over.
Go ahead.
Well, we do have some questions from the audience, so we can go to those a bit early until Clay joins us, which I think he might be coming back. But there he is. Sorry. Okay, Clay, if you hop off, I'll go to audience questions and we'll just wait for you to join. So I will duck out again until you are ready for me.
Oh, okay. Yeah, we'll do that in just a few minutes. And I want to apologize, obviously, to the hundreds of people that are part of today's conversation, but also, of course, to our guests. I assume that this is not part of the SolarWinds hack, but a problem specific to my machine and my my internet provider. I do apologize. Nationalism is something that each of you has touched upon as being part of kind of the core governing both strategy, how it's used, but also what is driving a lot of what Xi Jinping and his predecessors hope to achieve, what Vladimir Putin is trying to restore Russia's place, to make sure that Russia has the sort of place that he believes it deserves. And so, for reasons of convenience, they work together. They celebrate each other's birthdays, not because they love each other, not because they have deep feelings, but because they have some common interests. Now, both of these states have achieved quite a lot in certain realms. And yet both face internal problems. And so before we see China as 10 feet tall, before we see the Russians as completely without, without weakness on the intelligence front, maybe each of you could talk about some of the internal challenges that they face in their rivalry with the United States.
So when you look at Russia, and I think it's true of China, so I think we can meld them together a little bit, Jonathan, we answer the question. I would, in 2014, I put out Good Hunting, and remember, we were still in the terrorism world. We were almost beginning to forget that we lived in it, and we could be surprised tomorrow. But in 2014, it was very seemingly clear that we were going to be dealing with strong nationalist states. That was going to be the coin in the realm for the next 10, 15 years. You can't see much behind that. And I think that's what we're living with today. And our policy has to recognize that what we're up against are strong leaders in Korea, Iran, Russia, China. And they look around the world, and many of our allies, they've been replaced by strongmen. They're still allies, but they're strongmen. So there is a trend around the world. I would just make this note that I would put more money, if I was an insurance broker, on the life of a Democratic government or even a mediumly Democratic government than I would on an autocrat. They're more vulnerable today because we live in the day of cyber and the internet and social media. They are so much more vulnerable because of the tools of it. The Russians are behaving in the same way they did in the Cold War, but they have these great tools. We have great tools. We have decided, for prudent sake for the time being, not to apply them on the offensive. But my point is, both the Russians and the Chinese have built in vulnerabilities that aren't as visible. And I know Jonathan will dig down deeper. But if you look, even with Putin, things get stale. Autocrats get stale. You can only hold it down. And they forget the good job you did in getting the economy back. Most modern people now have short-term memory. So I think, the clock is ticking. I think Putin has his hand on it, and I think Xi does, and they're not going anywhere in a hurry. But I wouldn't be surprised someone to wake up and find out there's a big crisis in either country. And I'll just do the Russian, and Jonathan be kind enough to take over. But when I look at Russia and Novotny, I mean, you had 100,000 people come out in the middle of the winter in Russia. I mean, that takes some real commitment there. And I think it's a sticky wicket. 100,000 people sound like a lot. It is, but the social media capacity that you have to get different cities going, autocratic governments have a much harder time in modern age suppressing it. Hong Kong, you're talking about this tremendously powerful country. It was on its heels in trying to deal with Hong Kong. So there's vulnerabilities. I've been against autocrats. The problem is life is truly short when you make those bets. I mean, they can go on for a long time. I mean, Castro's been sitting in Cuba for a long time. So, but they're not. It is not a formula, positive one. And when you talk about China as the counterweight, it will be economic to military, but what it stands for is going to be a huge deficit. So that is their vulnerabilities. But Jonathan, let me pass it off to you.
Well, and Jonathan, we want you to respond to these internal challenges. But one of the things that Jack's talking about is that, certainly Putin's state controls broadcast media, but social media is alive and fairly well in Russia. And that's a contrast to some of what goes on in China. The Chinese party state has put a better lock on that free flow of information. But Jonathan, if you could talk about some of the challenges China faces.
Well, I mean, Jack's made a really great point here that one of the big weaknesses for both of these countries is, you know, in the Cold War, everybody could be a communist, but, you know, so they had that to sell the globe. But today, I mean, that's just not what either Russia or China are doing. I mean, they're ginning up an idea in both cases, I think, of sort of national rejuvenation. And the Chinese Communist Party explicitly calls it that. And I think that's also one of their ways of you know, mitigating sort of fragmentation in the country to create this, you know, cohesive narrative, this sense of purpose, belonging, destination that you know, a citizen can participate in. And Xi Jinping has this quote where he says, you know, backed by the invincible force of 1.3 billion people, we have the infinite stage for our era. And that's been the Communist Party's dream, which is very Leninist, that they're going to lead their population onto, you know, some kind of ultimate destination. So you know, the longer that coheres there, and I think the problem is that it used to be sort of built around economic sort of ascendancy, and you know, everybody's improving their livelihood. And I think it's increasingly built around militarism, where Xi Jinping talks regularly about preparing to fight and win wars in the region. You know, there's a very significant militarist discourse that I had to, you know, live through as a student, just meeting all kinds of people over there. But you know, those sorts of things are certainly the Communist Party's way to try and, you know, how would you put it, just deal with internal dissent, sort of put the country on a track that they can control. And at the same time, you're talking about a country that for its entire history has struggled with basically trying to consolidate its borders. I mean, Xinjiang, Tibet, you know, Hong Kong, sort of newer in that long history. But you know, Taiwan, I mean, they have quite a map of things that they believe belong to them and must be controlled. And you're talking about active territorial disputes with many of their neighbors. I mean, we saw the first use of lethal force by the Chinese military in last summer on the Himalayan border with India. And yet this is a country, you know, under party rule that fought wars against everyone from the United States in the Korean Peninsula to Vietnam on the Vietnam border to the Soviet Union itself in the Amur Valley in 1969. So you're talking about a country that's constantly in some sort of state of you know, action either internally or externally to maintain what it sees as its broader territory and ambitions. So so that does suggest weakness, but I think the real heart of the matter here is China's engagement with the world. You know, over the last 30 years, we opened up, you know, the global economy to China, which we obviously didn't do with the USSR. And it's everything from bringing supply chains over there to bringing them into the WTO to, at this point, investing in them. I mean, you go and listen to your average investment bank or financial institution. It's all about hot Chinese stocks or opportunities over there. And, you know, that's really the biggest weakness for China is whether or not, you know, it's up to us whether or not we continue to engage with their economy. And I think that it becomes increasingly untenable for us to do so. And the U.S.-China decoupling is probably the best response to the ambitions of the Communist Party. And if we continue to invest in them, if we continue to give them access to global markets and you know, our technology and such, then I think their ascendancy could continue in some, you know, very formidable way. But if we start to peel those things back, and that's where U.S. policy is already generally focused, then I think the world gets a lot more difficult for their ambitions. So China's, you know, we talk on some level about our dependency on China, you know, medical supply chains, you know, those sorts of things. But in fact, it's also China's dependency on the world that is something that, and they're very explicit about this. They seek to master that dynamic and you know, require that the world depends on them so that they have more leverage. And that's really the nature. I think that's the battle space for U.S.-China competition, is that dependency.
Well, and when you talk about tech decoupling, for example, that's something where the United States and other allies can definitely play a role. And many people, though, are not willing to go along with that. Jack mentioned the American focus after 9/11 in 2001, switching to terror, switching to battling that threat, and that perhaps lessened attention to Russia and that sort of thing. But for Chinese, when they think of 2001, they think of entry into the World Trade Organization and the dramatic rise in incomes that have come about. Now, one of the things that both of you hit upon, and I'd like you to talk about as we turn to Jessica and audience questions, is the question of alliances. And that is something that the United States has. But China, as Jonathan details in his book, has, through its trade networks and these sorts of things, built relationships not just on its immediate border, but beyond. And so if each of you could say something about alliances, and then we'll switch to Jessica, and Jessica will bring in questions from the audience.
Well, one of the things when I was describing why we had an advantage in the West in the intelligence world, and when I say intelligence, also diplomacy and economic, political, was that we had a really good product, and many people wanted to work with us. Many of the best spies come to us voluntarily, and they're often people of great passion. But the other thing that we don't normally dwell on, unless you're inside the ballpark on intelligence matters, and that is the force multiplier in intelligence that we had during the Cold War, and I submit continues to this day, that not only do our allies, and we have many allies around the world, but even the countries that used to be neutral were more neutral towards us than to the Russians, right? So, and what that gave you was you could draw on the resources of the local government that could do things that you would have to put 50 of your own people or their city right there to accomplish minor tasks. So it was a force multiplier. I can't underestimate how important, even when we look at China today, and if you look at China and Taiwan, but there's a lot of other countries around the area who are going to side with. So I want to put the emphasis there. The Chinese are not oblivious to this. They understand this. They got money. They're going to make money work. And they're buying. But you can only buy a certain type of love. So I'm not sure how deeply rooted this affection is among those countries, and we'll see the test of time. I think our alliances are really pretty healthy and strong, and it doesn't matter. Everyone's making an issue of who's president on them, but the reason the Brits are with us and why the Mexicans, they're overarching reasons of common interest, right? And I think when you get to the Chinese, they're going to have trouble finding those connections. And the other thing, there's like deep-seated things that are very difficult to articulate, but there's a bias against China just from doing business around the world, and it's something that they're going to have to contend with. They have to sell themselves harder, whether it's the communists or their history of decades of repression. They got a really hard time to convince people that they're really going to be a great ally. So, but they'll take their money, they'll do things with them, they'll build ports and so on, but it's the type of thing on one day they can say goodbye to the Chinese. I mean, so we're going to find out how ephemeral or how long lasting. And I guess I'm on the optimistic side that they can only run these cards so far.
Jonathan, if you could maybe pick up, and if you could be fairly brief so that we can get to Jessica's question. And of course, none of what we've said today, and none of the things in these books is to justify animosity, bias, discrimination towards people of Asian ancestry in the United States. And I intended to say that earlier, but that's of course absolutely true. In talking about the challenge posed by China, we are not suggesting that there's any challenge posed by people of Asian ancestry here in the United States. But please, Jonathan, go ahead.
On that, it's an important point. And I think what I would say is I actually believe China ought to be part of the West, and Russia. There ought to be a reset so that there's really should be historically, and Jonathan, I'll go back to you. We had warmer relations with the Chinese many, many years ago. The rest of the world was sort of odds with them. So it's really the system and its history, its modern history of repression, which I think is a hard sell. But the Chinese and the Russians have to reset with us. I think we should reset with them, but I don't see that happening. I mean, I don't see, if anything, if we listen to Jonathan at the beginning, she's getting harder, tougher in what he has to say.
No, exactly. I mean, there was a time when China was our ally in the Second World War, and that was obviously an incredibly important partnership. And then it's really the history since the Communist Party took power, that you wind up having a country where the party, essentially killed more of its own citizens than any other regime in human history. And that's we have to work our way through this current challenge from these authoritarian and totalitarian states in order to find our way to a better global order and reduce these problems. And that's why the importance of allies is just so essential. And I think this is one of the things that the Biden administration is doing really the right thing by focusing on that, and not just in Asia but also in Europe. Restoring, I think, a coherence to the global alliance system, which, let's face it, was built out of the Second World War, where you have two independent theaters, and I think has never been fully updated, honestly, for a global point of view. I mean, it's always sort of been Asia for Asia, Europe for Europe, and I think today in the 21st century, because of the nature of a handful of, at this point, collaborative, essentially anti-American threats in Russia and China. We're going to have to bring the alliance system into a view of the shared view of the problem emanating from both Russia and China, so that Europe can't ignore the issues coming from China, and certainly Asia has to recognize how Russia and China fit together. But what I said in Vision of Victory is you basically have to get three things right. You have to maintain the U.S. as the world's most powerful and largest economy. You have to maintain deterrence in the Pacific and an overwhelming military power vis-a-vis the People's Republic of China. And then you have to unite the democratic world. You need the world's democracies, the free world, essentially to cohere again around this problem. And I think we're starting to see that happen. I mean, it's certainly a major feature of American diplomacy right now. And it will be our greatest advantage if we can fully focus that on the issues at hand.
Thank you. And Jessica, thanks for your patience. Thanks for the patience of everybody who is with us. Take it away.
Thank you so much. And gentlemen, if it's okay, we might go a little bit long on the Q&A just because of the technical challenges we had. So if you need to hop off, let me know. We'll get right to it. Our first question, and Jonathan, I'm going to direct this one to you. Almost no high schools have Chinese language classes. Do you see that as an issue in how we deal with China? What should we do to encourage students to learn the history and language of China? And I would also add Russia to that. I felt like in high school, we didn't really learn much about this. So how do you see helping US students understand China and Russia better?
It's a great question, and it's sort of funny because when I started learning Russian when I was about 19 in college, there were about 5 people in my class, and a lot of people said, "Why are you learning Russian? That won't matter." It was about 2000, the year 2001 or something, 2003, I don't know. And it just seemed like, and I just thought, these are big countries. These are going to matter again, Russia, China, India. And I began, investigating all that essentially in my late teens and sort of undergraduate years. And lo and behold, I mean, here they are, and we all know they matter now. So I think, having a robust study of national security languages is going to be important. Having a very clear understanding of history of these countries, but also making sure that that's done on American terms. I mean, that's something I'd emphasize. I think we really don't want this to be done by Confucius Institutes. We don't want the Communist Party coming in and telling us what, Chinese history is and the importance of the party, and let's not talk about Tibet, and let's not talk about Xinjiang. And we have to make sure that that stuff isn't finding its way into our study of these countries, except as the propaganda of the this government. And I'm afraid that mix, it may have happened worldwide because the party put so much resource into. That's how they do their sort of information operations, is to show people a view of China that makes it seem very benign and such. So I think there's so much incredible scholarship that's done on China at this point. I mean, I had the privilege of studying with some of the best historians in the world at Oxford, and there's just no shortage of great research coming out of many countries around the world. So I think making sure that China studies is not influenced by the Communist Party, including language studies. That's step one. And then to resource it and to prepare for a long view, where I think it's very important for young people to learn these languages today, but also to recognize that these are national security languages. There are a lot of things that I did in Russia and China, hitchhiking all over the countries, hiding from the Chinese military in Tibet and truck convoys. You can't do that now. So it's not the same thing. I mean, these have to be sort of treated with great care and responsibility. And I think people have to recognize that we are now in what could be a potentially very dark contest with these two states.
Thank you so much. Jack, I'll direct this one to you.
I just want to make a comment. In the agency, you spend 2 years in learning Chinese. That's the length of time. So to get it to a working level, and Jonathan did it the right way, spend a couple of years in China and learn it quicker. But the reason it's not just learning a language, because China, all the people you're ever going to deal with are probably going to be speaking English, right? By the time you get around to it. But there's a great value of learning the language. When I went to the Italian school, which was only 8 months or 9 months, you learn about through the process. If it's the right type of training, you're learning so much through the language about the way the country thinks and its culture. There's another dimension to just being able to speak. You got to really understand the milieu you're in. So I just want to be careful that we don't confuse language with really a deeper appreciation that if you're going to be effective in China, you need to get a grasp on.
Thank you. Jack, I'll direct this one to you then, just kind of talking about the people. Xi and Putin are heads of governments who have misused their power for personal ambitions and dominance over other countries. Did the Chinese and Russian citizens of their respective countries approve of their actions?
I've never been asked that question. It's a really good one. Absolute power corrupts absolutely, right? I mean, is that Machiavelli or somebody of that ilk? So you're inevitably going to lead down the road. I'm amazed, by the way. I'm in the private sector now. How much corruption exists in the world? It's, as a spy, you should be a real hard-nosed person. I'm just really amazed at it. But different cultures have a different tolerance level for it. And I would say that both the Chinese and the Russian systems have long integrated corruption. I mean, trust me, during the communist days, there wasn't purity of business. And I think in China, there's corruption. What happens, you'll see great expose, it's because the group in power is taking out some other group. But inherent in autocratic governments is corruption. So it's another seed of destruction that the people eventually begin, enough is enough, right? We have a tolerance for it, but my children are now missing the medicine, or they're not getting the virus and someone else is getting shot. So corruption corrodes and speeds up the demise of an autocrat. So it's tolerated more in places where there are closed economies and so on, but I don't think they've reached that level yet.
Thank you. And Jonathan, I'm going to direct this one to you. What are your thoughts on the Chinese contract with the Iranian regime for 25 years, which includes the energy sector, internet and social media, nuclear energy, and bringing 500 security agents to Iran?
Well, I think on one hand, my understanding of this at present is it's sort of a guideline. I mean, it's something that's not sort of set in stone. So at least in that level, it's positioning to the world that there exists at least an aspirational, comprehensive relationship. I mean, I think it also quite clearly shows that China is willing to undermine sort of U.S. efforts to achieve its foreign policy goals vis-a-vis Iran. I mean, particularly through energy sales and that sort of thing. But I think we do have to contend with the fact that at worst we're going to wind up in something that's not just Russia and China versus America, but Russia, China, and Iran versus America. And right after the Alaska meetings between U.S. and Chinese diplomats, Lavrov, Russia's top diplomat, was in China talking about de-dollarizing the international system, finding ways to get around the international sanctions regime. A whole lot of Russia-China bilateral trade now is done in their own currencies and not through the dollar. So, if you could, I mean, I think it's certainly aspirational among these three places to find their way around some of the key foreign policy tools that the U.S. has, especially economic sanctions. And when you look at all the military exercises carried out by Russia and China around the world, from the Sea of Japan to the Baltic Sea to Chinese participation in Vostok in 2018. I mean, it's at least signaling. And there's always here and there some Iranian media saying that there's going to be a big Russia, China, Iran exercise and such. And I think clearly these three places are at least grandstanding a little bit in front of the U.S. and the Western world to show that they have each other and they have options. Once again, probably even more so than the Russia-China relationship. There are probably going to be some big holes in how durable that kind of thing is. I mean, not least of which is that the biggest energy supplier to China is not Russia, that's number 2, but Saudi Arabia. So, how does China really, which depends entirely on Gulf oil, reconcile its sort of Iran-Saudi relationships? I mean, these are going to be, they're going abroad in ways that are initially economic, but the geopolitics is going to be harder than you think.
But the countries we picked out here, you can remember, they're all desperate. They're alone. I mean, North Korea, Iran. I mean, who are they going to get in bed with? I mean, it said they're strange bedfellows, even the Iranians and Russians and North Koreans. So I think, if you're an autocrat, there's a small club. It's not like they're making these, when we talk about the United States, you're talking about a different type of quality of relationships and numbers of country and tradition and history. Here they go back to the arrangements of convenience. I wouldn't want to bet on over trust. I'm pretty sure in the back room, none of them trust each other. But it's, as Jonathan rightly points out, it's very convenient, very useful to do it. There's practical economic reasons. But it's not like there's a new ideology that's now growing in popularity. Nationalism, autocratism, corruption, and we're selling it to the world. It's a tough sell.
Yeah, so that kind of leads to this question then. Are Russia and China united in a goal, or is it just to weaken the United States? What are your thoughts?
Well, one of the things that Clay mentioned, he mentioned 1, 2, 3. He said U.S., NATO, and Russia. Someone should have asked him what was number 4, because I know what number 4 was. It was Russia, right? And so when he went in and when he came, he came out. So I don't know. I think I'm going to rest the case on that.
Fair enough.
I'd say something similar, but I think they don't have a shared long-term goal. I mean, if anything, especially on the Russian side, what's the long-term end state that they wind up being, the subordinated partner to China? I mean, Huawei's in Russia in ways that should concern them as much as it would concern us or Australia or any other country. I mean, why would you have Huawei building your telecoms infrastructure? And yet I think there's this dependency that has started, when it comes to, let's say, Arctic engineering is one manifestation. I mean, potential for collaboration in space. I mean, as Jack's pointed out to me, I mean, a lot of these things are more in sort of word than deed, but we shall see how far the sort of hard-nosed collaboration, does it start to take off? We'll see, especially in this decade. But I think China has a long-term goal, and I think Russia fares very poorly in what China's leaders call the community of common destiny for mankind. I mean, I think that's a world that they don't want to wind up in. As I have a passage in China's Vision of Victory when talking about Russia, I was at a DC think tank meeting where one of the Moscow think tank analyst was talking about we don't want to see China dominate Asia any more than we just don't want to see that. And I asked a question from the audience, so why are you selling them X, Y, and Z, meaning military systems? And she sort of paused and said, well, we have to sell somebody something. And I thought, wow, maybe
there's something missing in our question too, which is we're talking about what they're doing and how they're doing vis-a-vis. And I think there's a big question hanging over. What's our response to this? I mean, are we going to sit back with strategic patience, whatever that means? I know what that means, but how are we going to deal with this? Jonathan queued up some big concerns. I think I have, and so we're now talking. Well, they were doing this and they're doing that. They're doing this and they're doing that. My question to everybody, if we had time, we could all ask everybody in the audience, what's our response? What's our response to this?
Yeah, well, and we saw the companies, the American companies that were speaking out, like H&M and some others that are getting the pushback in China. So I don't know if you want to comment on that. I mean, they're trying to, I guess, speak up, and of course, there's economic ramifications for doing so.
Right, happy to comment on that. I mean, that's what I do now through my consulting startup, is advise U.S. companies on the changing geopolitics here. And I think, ultimately, what people are going to find is that it's going to be very hard to, connect and engage with the China market, particularly dependent on the sector you're in. I mean, if you're in a strategic industry where China has a program called civil military fusion, where they seek to bring the sort of innovation from the civilian sector and advancements in technology to their military. I mean, that I think rules out an entire tranche of what's reasonable for us to do with China economically. And then even in the consumer sector, I mean, last week with H&M and Nike, and you're starting to see examples of just regular people. I mean, knocking down stores, cutting up Nike jerseys and such. And this comes, I think there's been a regular pace of sort of, Western corporations sort of, whether NBA or Gap or, sort of saying we will do our best to not cause any trouble, but that's going to be a very hard position to maintain, and particularly because of the human rights abuses in Xinjiang, what the State Department has labeled a genocide. I think as researchers dig into this, I mean, there are more and more, multinational Western corporations that are inadvertently or indirectly tied into what's going on there. I mean, Xinjiang cotton or other aspects of the global supply chain. Really, I mean, companies have to fix that and really to disengage. I mean, that's the only, I think, right thing to do. But then to build a business strategy that is prepared for that, so that people have bought into the China market for 30 years, and if it's really meant to be a core plank of a business's future, I think they need to assess risk from an entirely new point of view.
Jessica, if I could interject for just a moment. It seems to me that we might make 2 points, and one is connected to something that Jack said and something Jonathan said. What are we doing? What are we doing? And how are we investing to develop our capabilities, be they linguistic, but also certainly on the science and tech front, and to invest in that? China is almost reached the same level of research and development investment in terms of percentage of GDP as the United States. And so that is an issue. We have to do those kinds of things. And Jack talks about the long-term need to invest in strengthening our intelligence capabilities and other resources. In his book, he highlights some of these things. So part of what has to happen is on that front. But Jonathan has just been talking about the response of individual companies. And one of the things that's really striking through this pandemic year is there is no local anymore. There is no global. It's all together. And so a company like Nike that is on the forefront of social justice concerns here in the United States, and their individual representatives, spokespeople, the athletes that endorse them, those sorts of things, and companies like H&M, a European-based company that wants to exemplify a commitment to human rights, and then gets banged over the head in China. And so it is an increasingly globalized information market. And so we see the response on the Chinese side, we see the response on the Western side, one side cheering, one side jeering. And so this is going to be increasingly difficult for companies, and more companies are going to be brought into this discussion.
Before we get to companies, though, I think I had a hedge fund come visit me 4 years ago. I thought he was pernicious. And he said, Jack, why don't you collect intelligence to help me make bets on the supply chain between US companies and China? And it's a really good point. I mean, how vulnerable is American business to the supply chains if the decoupling that Jonathan anticipates comes around? So we are an immensely powerful country. And what's interesting about it is most Americans don't see themselves this way. We don't use our power the way the world thinks, the way we are established, and we are more reserved. But to the outside world, they have a better appreciation of how powerful. It isn't that we don't have the capability, that we don't have the intelligence, that we don't have the wherewithal to deal with the problem. What I think is that there's an essential lack of consensus among us, the American people, policymakers, on how to deal with the problem. In other words, the businessman trying to figure out where the supply chain is has to be plugged in and understand the macro side of the issue. Where are we? How are we going to deal with our, it's not a deficit here. It's how are we going to deal with Russia? Russia take nuclear weapons, but it's a really small power. So how are we going to deal in this world? And I think, I can deal with the business part, and we can certainly go there. But I'm more troubled by the fact that while the Russians are operating, and this has been going on for many years, it's not a Republican Democratic issue. My problem is we don't have a consensus about how to deal with it. And there's no rules of the road on how to deal with cyber or how to deal with these other challenges. It's not clear. And that was not the case in the Cold War. We had a consensus around what our behavior was going to be. And I think we don't have that defined. And I don't hear the right voices helping define it.
I agree. I mean, it's really a moment that calls for a new American grand strategy. I mean, we had a grand strategy coming out of the Second World War that set us up for success across a 45-year Cold War with the USSR. And we had a sense of what was at stake, what the nature of the contest was, and what we needed to do. And I think just sustaining that and sort of iterating that allowed us to prevail in a major contest over half a century. And this is another time where we're going to have to realize that the sort of unipolar moment was the year 2014 was mentioned at one point today, and that was the year where Crimea happened and China first moved its oil rigs into the South China Sea. So in that moment, I think we saw the shift in what these two powers and their followers think they can do in the world. And it's a deep challenge to American order and to the free world as such. And it's going to be a process of rebuilding along three things. I mean, economics, defense, and diplomacy. You get those three things right. And I think that's where actually the companies do play such an important role, because it was our companies that helped us win the Second World War. It was our companies that sort of evolved from DARPA's tech advancements into Silicon Valley. I mean, there's always been this sort of at high points a great relationship between U.S. national security and private enterprise in America, and even big business. And I think we have to find that relationship again, because at the end of the day, the way that China, their fundamental strategy, which I haven't really had a chance to touch on entirely, but it's to become the dominant economy, and therefore, and on top of that, to build in the military power that secures their global interests. I mean, that's the sort of mechanics of it. And they believe that they can do that based on their sheer size. And if they do that, we'll be stuck with a problem that we may not be able to solve. Whereas today, the U.S. is the world's most powerful economy, and that is very much in contest over the next this coming decade. So we're going to have to make sure that we win on that. And I think we need our companies and our business leaders to participate in this. That to me would really help change the tide, and that will unlock the resources for us to then outcompete China in all the other things that matter, whether that's intelligence, defense, diplomacy, but fundamentally we need to begin by being able to out-resource the competition. We've always been able to do that. Second World War, Cold War, always been able to do that. And that's really, I think, the core question of this contest is, will we finally wind up, head to head with a place that can out-resource us? So I think we start there, and the companies matter there, because otherwise our national security will become far harder to handle in the decades ahead.
It's not my original thinking. I read something in the Wall Street Journal about a week ago. I thought the fellow had a good comment. And that is, going forward, businessmen, well, let me start at the top. The government, the legislature, business, every decision you're making on China, you have to stop and think about what are the implications on the national security issue. What are the implications for you in terms of the durability of the supply chain? In other words, we need to think about China rather than, hey, here's a place to make a buck, no holds barred. So there has to be, and I think Jonathan just noted that, a new way of looking at the challenge that we're facing, and it takes everybody's participation. including American business. But I'd still come back. There's an overarching thing. The business needs something to work with, and where are we going as a nation vis-a-vis China and Russia?
So don't just consider the short-term gain, but the long-term cost is kind of what they should be doing. Gentlemen, thank you so much. I know we went a little bit long for the Q&A, but we really appreciate it. Hopefully you'll come out to Southern California and we can host you in person.
Thank you to Jack Devine, Dr. Ward, and Clayton Dube for an informative and insightful discussion today. We so appreciate the partnership with the USC U.S. China Institute. And thank you everyone who joined us today. And for our attendees, you may purchase Jack's and Dr. Ward's books at Chevalier's bookstore. Thank you all. As Jessica said, we need to have you all back soon, whether it's virtual or in person. Thank you so much.